Hello, everybody. We're going to have an introduction today to Thomas Hardy, A Wife in London. We'll have a talk about this now, and then on Friday, when we do the meet, we can talk about it a bit more. So, I'm going to give you a little bit of background to the poem. We'll talk through it. I'll give you some questions to have a think about before Friday, just in the same way that we normally do it in the lesson, and then we can discuss those a little bit more when we do the meet. So we've moved on to the Victorian poems. We're going a little bit out of sequence because I thought this one was a bit more accessible. So we're looking at Thomas Hardy now, Wife in London. So he's a Victorian poet. He was born 23 years after Dickens, so we're in that same sort of era. Just a little bit later and a little bit younger than Dickens, but same sort of thing. He wrote towards the end of the Victorian era. So the other Victorian poets, Dickinson and Browning, who we'll look at in the later on in the anthology, we would normally have done them first, but they're a little bit more tricky. So I wanted to try this out using this one first of all. So he's writing in this poem about the Boer War, or the Boer War is the background to this poem. Now, there were two Boer Wars, but the one we're looking at here was fought between 1899 and 1902, and this poem was written in 1899, so at the beginning of the Boer War. It was fought in South Africa, and thousands of British soldiers died during this war. So it was there was quite a lot of loss of life, but all over in South Africa where the British were fighting the Dutch. Hardy disagreed with the war. He was quite critical about the war, and you can see that come through in the poem. I apologise, by the way, my British should have a capital B. I'll change that before I share the slideshow with you. Lots of women were widowed by this war, and the wife in question in the poem has been widowed, and there was no support offered to them. So a lot of women were left kind of destitute. Really, they had no income, no way of kind of keeping their houses or looking after their children. Many of them, if they were in that situation. He wasn't religious, so there's no kind of thoughts of redemption or hope of a better life in heaven or anything in this poem, so don't look for anything religious because it isn't there. Poem was written about 100 years after the peak of the Industrial Revolution, so after the cities are full of factories and lots of people have then moved to the cities, they're getting really embedded. And in the poem, he references these fogs in London, which were caused by coal being burned to power the homes, but particularly the factories of London. And you may have heard of these thick fogs. They were often called pea supers. Very thick, often yellowish, greenish, black fogs. Very, very thick, contained soot and sulfur dioxide, which meant that they smelled bad, and that's where the kind of the yellowish colour comes from. Caused a lot of breathing problems. Lots of people died, not from breathing in the fogs, but old people, people who had existing kind of lung conditions, really struggled, or sometimes it could give them these lung conditions. They were sometimes known as killer fogs because of that, and they could last for months once they descended. So if you imagine kind of living in a city that's just this thick fog for kind of months on end, this went on quite a lot, and only actually stopped in the early 1900s when the Clean Air Act was brought in. But the fogs were often worse close to the Thames because they mixed with the water, and it made the fogs even worse, and that's where the poorest people tended to live. So poor housing became even poorer thanks to the fogs. So there's a few images here of kind of what life might look like through these very, very thick fogs. As you can see, you can barely see across the Thames there. The light in the lamps to try and get a bit of light. There's some drawings, obviously, of the fogs in the streets there, because they didn't really have photographs in Victorian times in the same way as we do now. And you can see they're carrying torches during the day to try and see some light to guide people through the city. So the poem itself tells the story of a wife who receives the news that her husband has been killed in the Boer War. She receives a telegram to give her the news. Sorry, I've got my window open, so you might be able to hear cars going past. She receives a telegram which might have looked something like this. This is a telegram from from a different war, but they would receive this very short note, which would basically tell them here, this one says your gallant son has passed away about midnight. Obviously this is for a husband, but a very short message they would get. So she receives this telegram, and then the next day she receives a letter from her husband, which obviously is written and posted before he was killed. And in it he describes his hope for a happy future, which obviously they are never going to get. And here's a kind of an example of, again, a letter. This one actually was from South Africa. You can see on the address, and the date is 1900. So this was a letter from a soldier in the Boer War. So that's kind of the letter that she receives in the second part of the poem. So if you want to get, you might want to pause the video at this point to get your key quotations highlighted. We'll go through these key quotations on Friday, but these are the 6 that you want for the poem. So I suggest you pause it now and you just highlight those. So we'll have a read through of the poem, and then we'll have a little talk about what some of the words mean. So title obviously here, A Wife in London. Section 1 is the tragedy. She sits in the tawny vapour that the city lanes have uprolled, behind whose webby fold on fold, like a waning taper, the street lamp glimmers gold. Oh, cold, sorry. A messenger's knock cracks smartly. Flashed news is in her hand, of meaning it dazes to understand, though shaped so shortly. He has fallen in the far south land. Part 2, the irony. 'Tis the morrow, the fog hangs thicker. The postman nears and goes. A letter is brought whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker his hand, whom the worm now knows. Fresh, firm, penned in highest feather, page full of his hoped return, and of home-planned jaunts by break and burn in the summer weather, and of new love that they would learn. Okay, so the first 2 stanzas are describing the telegram and her receiving the telegram and finds out that she's dead. He's dead, sorry. And then the second 2 stanzas describing the letter that she receives from him the following day. So the first stanza there, sorry, my face is covering some of the definitions there, but I'm going to share this slideshow with you anyway, then you can have a look at that. So we've got the title, A Wife in London, the tragedy. She sits in the tawny vapour. Now the tawny vapour there is the smog. So tawny is orangey brown or yellowy brown, and vapour is kind of like a mist. That the city lanes have uprolled. So she's describing there, or Hardy's describing there, how the fog would kind of roll in from the Thames and then kind of roll up through the street. So there's this sense that the fog is kind of rolling through. So uprolled is kind of meaning like rolled up. Behind whose webby fold on fold, like a waning taper, the street lamp glimmers gold. So the fog itself is kind of like a web. Saying it's behind this web of fog. The street lamp is glimmering. And she says, he says, so it's like a waning taper, so like a very thin candle that's getting weaker and weaker. So there's this sense here of a city covered in smog, and the wife of the title sitting amongst this smog. She's presumably in her house, but amongst this smog and darkness and this very pale light shining through the fog. So there's a few questions here for you to think about, and as I say, I'll share these questions with you and I'll share the slideshow with you. So I just want you to have a look at those questions and have a think about that and be ready to talk to me about those on Friday. So I'm not going to read through those now because hopefully you can read through those yourself. So the second stanza here now is where she gets the message. So a messenger's knock cracks smartly. So the messenger has come to the door with a telegram, knocked on the door. Smartly is kind of quickly and sharply. Flash news is in her hand, so he knocks on the door straight away, gives her the telegram, it's in her hand and he's gone. So it's very sudden. Of meaning it dazes to understand. Strangely worded line there, and I've asked you to have a think about why that might be so strangely worded and a little kind of confusing. Daze in this sense is rendering someone unable to think clearly, usually because they're shocked or distressed. So that might help you to think about why that line is a bit confusing. Though shaped so shortly, that's reference to the telegram. So it's very short. What's written on there is very short. And underneath, that is what she's told. He has fallen in the far south land. The far south land being South Africa, and fallen as in the yellow box, uses a euphemism for death in battle. So a euphemism, remember, is where you make something sound more pleasant than it is by using a different terminology for it. So fallen, dead, or killed in battle usually refers to being killed in battle. So the second stanza there, she gets the message. So first she's sitting in the smog. Second stanza, she gets the message, very sudden, shocks her. Her husband's been killed. 3 questions there for you to have a think about. Then we move on to the third stanza, so the start of the second section, the irony. 'Tis the morrow, means it's the next day, day after. The fog hangs thicker. The postman nears and goes. So the postman comes to the door and then goes away again. A letter is brought, whose lines disclose by the firelight flicker his hand, whom the worm now knows. So the lines of the letter, disclose means give information which had previously been secret or hidden. So the lines of the letter give information, and she reads it by the firelight, so as the fire is flickering. His hand, whom the worm now knows. So his hand here refers to both his handwriting and his physical hand. So it's presumably his physical hand whom the worm knows, because the worms are eating him as he's in the ground after he's been killed. So third stanza, she receives a letter. So she's got the message in the second stanza, and here the following day she receives a letter. Some questions again there, 4 questions about that stanza that you'll need to have a look at. And then the fourth and final stanza tells us the content of this letter. So fresh, firm, penned in highest feather. So this letter there is written full of youth and enthusiasm and life. Pen means written, and highest feather is full of vigour and enthusiasm. Page full of his hoped return. So he's written a full page about what he's looking forward to, what his hopes are when he returns. And of home planned jaunts by break and burn in the summer weather. So he's thinking about little trips out they can take. A jaunt is a little journey in the woods or by the streams in the lovely summer weather. So he's thinking about what will happen when he returns. So he's full of these trips and of new love that they would learn. So he's hopeful that their love will develop further and they can kind of grow even closer and enjoy their lives together. So a very poignant and sad ending to the poem, because obviously none of that is going to happen. A few questions about that stanza as well. So that will help you hopefully to start having a think about the meanings of the poem. And then final set of questions, or one question really, about structure. So if you think about the structure of it and what's significant, and I've given you some clues, with what's in green. So it's a very regular rhyme scheme and structure. So it's 4 quintets and it's got alternate rhymes. So it's very, very regular all the way through. So think about what that might be suggesting to us. And it's divided into these 2 very distinct sections. So the first 2 stanzas with the telegram and the second 2 stanzas with the letter. So again, have a think about what message is being given to us by the fact that there are these 2 distinct sections. Okay, so we'll have the meet on Friday, so Friday the 19th, so that's this Friday at 2 p.m. I'll put the link on to join on Google Classroom. I'll put it on a little bit before 2 so that we can all get on for 2. For then, I'd like you to have a think about those questions that are on there and have a think about what you might want to say about those 6 key quotations. Obviously, we'll talk about those on Friday, but there's a reason why they're key quotations, and some of it's been picked up in the questions, but not all of it. So if you could be having a think about those, make yourself some notes. It is worth watching the GCSE pods if you've not already done that, but having a think about those questions will hopefully get you to the content that we need to talk about on Friday. I'm really looking forward to seeing you all, so I hope as many of you join as possible. Also on Friday we'll have a talk about whether or not you think this is working, or whether you want this style, whether you want me to consider something different. I know I've whipped through that poem. I might have gone a bit quickly, but you can always pause it. I'm going to stop talking now because we can have a chat on Friday about what we think will work or won't work. I look forward to seeing you all then. Bye bye.